Your Imperial, Royal Highnesses, Habsburg-Lothringen, Dr. Thomas Schroeck, Angelo Robbles, dear esteemed guests, einen wunderschönen guten Abend. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Jó estét kívánok. Buonasera. Dober večer. Bonsoir. I would like to share some thoughts before I introduce you to the program tonight. And I want to take you on a little journey which started this Monday when I picked up this gentleman, Angelo Robbles, from the airport after an overnight flight from JFK to Vienna. And we had been sitting in the car, transferring to the hotel, and starting to ponder. And aren't we humans amazing? We start having thoughts, our unique thoughts. We transfer it to ideas. We make other people joining in with their ideas. And things start manifesting. And here we go. We are here tonight. I feel privileged that I know many of you tonight. The ones I do not know, happy to catch up tonight. But I want to introduce, my name is Galambos, Alexander Galambos. I am a multifaceted entrepreneur and created some passion for family business, family offices, from a very operational point of view, I would say. I am basically the one with this initial thought I'd been talking at the beginning. But I consider myself as just a puzzle piece. And many other puzzle pieces had been joining to make this come happening tonight. Our panelists, the Natural Gem team, Matabi, our social media team. And these puzzles will fall into place and will create a bigger picture. I remember, tonight we're talking about turbulences, put it like that. So we're all going to talk about turbulences, and turbulences bring a lot of change and opportunities normally. So we will talk about opportunities. And sometime earlier this year, we had the opportunity to talk with Mrs. Donatella Ceccarelli about what I think we created to be hyper transformations. It means that a lot of transformation is happening in many, many areas. So one would say the only real constant is change, right? Isn't it? And I think we created this analogy together with, we are all kind of sitting in a plane, in plain air, in flight, and we are building this plane in the air. So I would say in such a situation, there is no time for us to lose, isn't it? So every second counts. So how can we save time? Because nobody of us has time nowadays, right? So we can create shortcuts. And one of those shortcuts is something we do tonight here. We create knowledge, we share knowledge, and share best practices. This will create shortcuts for us and will save time. As a matter of fact, we will have a very successful evening. Why? Number one, and I have many, many good news for you, as a matter of fact. Number one is, quote, Woody Allen, showing up is at 80% of success, right? So check mark. So we have, second good news, we have to take care about the remaining 20%, right? Check mark. And we are here to have tonight creating shortcuts together. So that's check mark 3. And I truly believe in the fourth good news, which is that 1 + 1 doesn't add up in 2, but it leverages to 3. So I invite you tonight to become puzzle pieces, and we together create the bigger picture through truthful, insightful exchange and conversations. So happy to tell you about the program for tonight. So we will start off with a keynote interview, which will take us like 60 plus minutes. And due to the fact that many people couldn't make it for different reasons, we decided also to record this. And as you can see, the interview itself will be recorded, and then we will share it to the community. After this 60 minutes, we will go offline, go off record, and we'll have the chance to do a Q&A for another like 30 minutes. So I kindly ask you to keep your questions for this Q&A part, but do take your questions to that part. After that, we will start our socializing. So socializing plus some little culinary journey as well. If there's anything I can do for you, just please don't hesitate and contact me. So may I introduce to you Mr. Angelo Robbles, founder and CEO of FamilyOffice TV and founder of FamilyOffice Association. And with no further ado, I would like to hand over to you.
You're very kind. Thank you so much, Alexander. And he's been nothing but such a gracious host as I've gotten to know him. I think I surprised him when I came in from the airport. I came in from Wyoming into New York. He probably didn't expect someone that he thought was from New York to come with a big, black, 10-gallon Stetson cowboy hat. But he got the full Wyoming effect. But he took good care of me. Wiener Schnitzel, apple strudel with, of course, warm vanilla pudding. So I feel like I'm Austrian now at heart, having all this great food, but now I need to find a CrossFit. But I'm so excited to be here. My life and my passion for decades has been family offices, and I know that's such a narrow community, and now's not the time as to how I got in it or why I have a passion and desire for it, but it's what I do. If I really had to define it, incredibly successful families and their family offices. I'm curious. I like to ask questions. I want to understand what are the best practices, not just in my country in the United States, but in Europe and Asia and other parts of the world. So I've been very fortunate having traveled around the world, but probably Austria in the last couple of days, and certainly thanks to Alexander, has been incredibly kind. I greatly appreciated it. And effectively for me, I'm learning so much. My audience has heard me say before, the highest ranked black belt, I think it was 10th degree judo master, and I'm forgetting his name. And it's a real story, not just because it sounds good, but he was on his deathbed and he said, please, to his spouse, bury me in my white belt. And that attitude, and we all have a level of success, and sometimes we don't identify our blind spots, and we let our ego get in the way. And that saying kind of always stuck with me whenever I feel I'm trapped in perhaps a little bit of the latter too, to remember that I'm always a lifelong learner, and everyone, and I mean everyone, has something to teach me and that I could learn from. So it's really, again, an honor to be here, and such an amazing group of people that I'm having a chance to talk to. I've gotten a chance to know Dr. Thomas Schroeck over the last couple of days. We have so much in common. He's been nothing but a gentleman as well. Everyone's been so cordial. I greatly appreciate the great people of Austria. And you're doing really amazing work as one of the deep thought leaders in terms of what you do in GEMS. I've been interested in GEMS for decades, so it's been really an honor to have a chance to meet you. And of course, really an honor to be here with your Imperial and Royal Highness. Thank you so much. We had a chance to catch up a little bit before, and broadly his knowledge of the world, how the world works, my country, the United States. Like in basically 10 minutes, he told me 3 things I didn't even know about my own country. And it was amazing, which again goes to show that Europeans are, of course, very cultured, very educated, and I have so much to learn. But it's been a great pleasure. So the opportunity tonight, and I think Alexander hinted at it, was turbulent times. Now, some of you could argue the world is always going through turbulent times, and it's not incorrect. But I think we'll all agree it's more challenging now. the news, social media, the threat of war that could be nuclear. There's lots of challenges that we do have. And part of the work that I do with families, and I got accused even 10 years ago when I started it as, that's a little, we would call it in the US hyperbole. Angelo, what could go wrong? So I started something called sovereign risk that could happen. And the challenge with many Americans in the United States is they don't think anything could happen. And there are massive advantages to the United States, but there also are grave challenges. So it took me down a journey that, again, I'm still a beginner in, relative to sovereign risk and disaster preparedness, especially during turbulent times. And that leads me here to learn more, to have a chance to interview two fine gentlemen. And this is a great honor. So perhaps I'll start, Your Imperial and Royal Highness, with you with a question. We are going through turbulent times. An example or an advantage, I could argue, that your family in the history has seen turbulent times before. Perhaps history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. If you could talk a little bit about the perspective of so-called turbulent times and how your family has navigated other times that were also challenging.
That's a huge question you're trying to ask. I'll try to answer it in a short form. I don't think that our times per se are more turbulent on a global basis. But I do think that we have certain challenges that are taking place in not only in Europe but also in the Western world as a whole. And the turbulence itself is like the stock market. If the stock market is flat, it's very boring. There's no opportunity. So turbulence creates opportunity. And if you want to take it geopolitically, I think we're sort of at a turning point in time, very similar that we had about 100 years ago when we had the First World War. Sort of, there are similar signs. And do we say history repeats itself? No, but humanity tends to make the same mistakes again and again and again, so it tends to have that effect of seeming to repeat itself. And I think that's the innate issue, that we are born as children and we have to start from learning from zero. And we go through this learning process always. So that's having a big effect on us as a whole. But I think that we have globalized things in a new dimension. The pandemic, I think, is probably the best example in history. We never had this type of concerted reaction to a perceived threat ever on a global scale. It's quite unique. And I think it should teach us to be very wary of what is happening in this world and how things take a sort of automatic process. And why is this interesting? Because this is exactly what got us actually into the trouble of the First World War. There were so many agreements in place that said, well, if this happened, you must react. And this is a chain reaction process. So the WHO, together with all countries, have agreed, if we have an outbreak of some sort of virus, then we must take this action. And governments don't have the ability to decide differently. They must take this action. So coming back to that, what is, say, our focus in family offices and our activities. Family offices, I think, today have a very great responsibility because they have become the investment bankers of today. Our banks are so regulated and restricted, they are actually no longer able to participate in this process. And as family offices, again, we're looking at how to invest our funds, not only to protect our own interest, our own families, but also, as we discussed before, we also want to contribute something back to society. So the social aspect, which I think it's a great responsibility we have. And as we have seen, everyone who has been working in this field, and I've been working with my wife in this for now quite a few years, and we spend a lot of time trying to plug holes which governments aren't covering. So we have a huge responsibility to do that because governments aren't able to deal with this situation. But it also says, how are we going to take care of that, what we're doing? How do we protect our families? So obviously we try to earn money, we try to invest as safely as possible, and we need to diversify our risk. And one of the ways to diversify that risk is the cooperation that we have here with the Natural Gem and with Dr. Thomas Schroeck. Gemstones are a very interesting part of that equation. Why? Because it produces added value. It has a growth aspect to it. So if I look at it from a family office point of view, everything that we want to invest in should be producing added value. We wish to stay out of services. We want to produce food, we want to produce energy, we want to produce something that is essential. And you're coming from the United States, and I think the United States has one asset, really, really fundamental asset, and that is really a sovereign country. Why? Because it can feed its own people and it can supply its own people with energy. And actually a country which cannot do those two fundamental things, education and healthcare and all those things come in. But if you cannot feed your own people and you cannot supply your people with energy, you actually lose that little tick, what I'll call sovereignty. You become dependent on other structures, on other people. And those tend to be the types of things that lead to wars. They're the haves and have-nots in a time of crisis, and that becomes dangerous. So those are the things that in these times, and we say yes, they're unstable times in a certain degree, yes, and we need to take as much proactive action to deal with those situations. But at the same time, there's huge opportunities that are given to it. And I haven't even gotten into the crypto story.
I didn't expect that, but we could go down that road. I know we'll be covering a little bit of that from one perspective. Amazing, great answer and great insight, and a little bit of pushback, rightfully so, on the turbulence idea. I'm going to mention 4 things that happened in Europe. Shockingly, Americans sometimes know these things. That were, I could argue, narrowly more risque, more challenging, and that would be the 1620s English Reformation, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and Nazi Germany. There was something that happened to a majority, I would argue, of the capital of incredibly successful families. To a degree, they were largely taken out. When you have a populace, which is have-not, and I believe the mathematical economic formula is the have-nots needing to spend, and you hinted at it, 40% or more of their income and resources for food, that tends to lead to a lot of unrest, uprising. And by the sheer law of numbers, they're probably going to win. So that creates a grave challenge. Families of wealth in Europe, when I talk about these, they know that. In the US, we don't know this. So I look at a couple of assets, and we'll tie Thomas into this in a second. Land, art, gold, and absolutely gems. If you could talk a little bit, then I have a specific question for you about that, how those 4 assets were important from a family legacy and history in withstanding hard times.
Well, I think the first most important thing when you take those sort of assets in a historical perspective, silver and gold is money. So what we understand is paper money or credit paper or whatever, it's sort of a modern concept. So gold and silver is money. It's a matter of method of payment. It's something that we trust in and sort of believe in. Gemstones were always an investment. It was always a representation of fortune. So historically, a ruling family needed to have a certain fortune to secure the state, because they were funding the state in a certain aspect. Yes, they also collected taxes and things like that, but the most fundamental success of a government was that it had enough assets, and they were typically gemstones, not gold and silver. That's just, it's money. That's a really, really, really important concept to get used to, because from a modern point of view, if you have gold and silver in a safe, in a bank, it's costing you money. You're paying insurance, you're paying deposit fees and things like that. So if you want to keep out of the inflationary side, you need to keep it at home. But it's really hard to take it with you if you have to go somewhere fast. So if you're talking about levels of unrest and you want to get your family to safety, you're going to have a hard time of taking 500 pounds or 500 kilograms of gold with you. But having some jewelry with some very precious stones worked into it, or just the stones themselves, you can put a small fortune in your pocket and run fast. And that I think is, in a modern context, it's really important. I think, you know, if you have that ability, you should have a little bit of gold and silver in coins that people recognize. Gold bars is very hard to recognize, and people look at it like, what's this? But if you have a coin that has some sort of recognition as money, then that's great. If you have a little bit more reserves, you can go into gemstones, put some of them on the side. You can distribute them in the world. What we're talking about, the next step is, of course, your investments. Where are you investing? If you take real estate as an example, you may not want to just have real estate in one place, in one country or one continent. Start spreading it around. But it's sort of the ladder that you go up. The more funds you have available, the more flexibility you have. Where you want to go with that.
Of course. And Thomas, relative to that, land, art, gold, and gems. Land, as you noted, it's great. It's been a historical investment since the beginning of time and feels that way. But it's not something that you could take with you. And again, as United States, we're not used to effectively the land being taken from you, but it could. Well, actually, that's not quite true. We have what we call eminent domain. If the government wants your land, they could take it. There's supposed to be a due process. They pay you what they deem it's going to be worth, but if they really wanted it, they could. Effectively, governments always have the ultimate power. Possibly the family could get that land back at a future point. Gold, as we discussed, it's wonderful, but you would need to be Hercules to carry so much around where it's going to be worth that amount of money. Art has a little more potential. In theory, it could be rolled up, it's light. But gems, Thomas, that is one. I thought about it, and I actually did some of the math. In one hand in today's world, I believe if I get the right combination of colored diamonds, rubies, and sapphires, I could hold up to about 600 million USD. Talk a little bit about the issues that we discussed, the 4 assets that I noted, and really gems are the only one with that amount of capital that is truly incredibly transportable.
Well, gems are part of our history for 5,000 years for investment. And as we know from the Habsburg family as an example, there were pieces which belonged to the family, there were pieces which were not allowed to be sold, and there were pieces which were privately owned by the family. So if we go back a little bit in history, gems itself, they are defined as something hard, something rare, and something, as you mentioned it, sparkling or beautiful, or how we want to say it. And at the beginning, it was a sign of power, not of money at the beginning, because it was used what you call the high hat, that means the crown.
Crown jewels, yes.
The crown jewels, to connect people with the heavens, or the heaven, as you want to mention it. You're right, it's the highest concentration of wealth, of money, of value, according to weight and room. They are easy to transport, that's right. We have heard a lot about gems now, but I am absolutely knowing that gems are just one niche product in the total consistent, or the total part of the investment today. In some cultural areas like Asia, if you speak to a wealthy Asian family, it's not the question if they have gems, the question is how many or how much in value they have. I know some families there with a huge fortune, up to $300, $500 million only in stones. In Europe, it got a little bit out of fashion in the 19th century when we got all these papers like shares at the beginning, bonds later, and all the other methods later. I would say it's a good thing to have some part of my fortune in stones. I'm absolutely a fan of coins as well, because it's easy to pay. As you say it's money.
High level recognition. Yeah.
Absolutely, I like that. And to have some part in gems or jewelry is just a good idea.
No, it's really good. I mean, you know, from an investment point, Thomas will explain that in more detail, but the quality of stone for investors is much higher than stones that are generally used for jewelry. But you can take, of course, these investor stones and put them in jewelry also. It's a good combination between the two things. But the real value is, of course, the gemstone itself. The artwork around it, unfortunately, is in a situation of stress, worthless. But
About the gold, of course.
It gives you the opportunity to enjoy it a little bit more than something that's just locked up in a safe. It's like having beautiful artwork. If it's worth a fortune, it's getting difficult to insure it if it's going to hang on my wall, but why would I want to have it if I can't appreciate it? So gemstones, it goes a little bit in this. It's a more sentimental value as well, particularly if it was given to you by somebody special.
It's a good point on the investment side, but because by nature I tend to look at things from a risk perspective, having dealt with billionaires and amazing families around the world, they already have incredible success, which is more than just financial. The risk is what could happen to it. And sure, investments, taxation, wealth transfer are incredibly important topics, but there's also much more, and we'll get into shortly governance and decision-making in the family and the rising generation, but specifically that from a risk perspective relative to gems, Thomas. My question's going to be, sure, I want to wear some of it and showcase it. I want to have some in my home. If something really were to happen incredibly urgent, it's there and ready to go. I may want to have some in a bank safety deposit box. I may want to have some in various countries and geographic diversities, like you mentioned in real estate. But by nature, if things were to get bad, I don't know if I 100% trust banks. In the US, we've had multiple pretty significant, not the biggest 5, but pretty significant banking failures earlier this year. Things could go wrong. Therefore, what options would I have, Thomas, other than my home, other than a banking company? Now, I know, because I'm interested in the subject, where to go in Switzerland, but talk a little bit to our audience about a level of diversity they would have.
Well, there are private vaults, like we have one around the corner here, the Tresor next to us. There are vaults nowadays in the US, in Switzerland as well, like in the Gotthard mountain,
yes,
where you can store stones or where you can store gold, of course. But I'm with you. I would like to have them quite close to me and maybe distribute some around the world, depends how many I have of them. But it's the same with all type of wealth. I wouldn't store everything at one point and not at one bank. And the same is with gemstones.
And maybe on that subject from the investing perspective, it would simplify my life. Okay, yes, I believe in gems. Let's not even say as much from a beauty perspective and wearing it, but from an allocation and investing perspective. Do I concentrate my holdings in a couple of colored diamonds, sapphires, and rubies, or a little bit like investing in equities and stocks? Am I better off having, although it's more work, not quite as efficient, more diversity in the type and size and even quality to a degree of gems?
You're completely right. It's better to do a selection, a bigger selection of stones, not to have one, depending, of course, on the total quantity of money you want to invest. That's clear. But most of the people I know with a variety of gems have a large number of gems. We even have some customers from Hungary. They start with half-carat jewelry quality diamonds. The price of one of these diamonds is 1,600 US and roughly the same price as 1 ounce of gold, but much easier to transport. And then they go up into higher qualities, because there is one thing: the higher the quality, the higher the increase in value in the long run. A diamond, half carat, jewelry quality is not an investment. It is something I can use if I want to spread it out, if I want to give it away. It's good therefore, but it's not an investment. Investment starts in a different field of higher quality.
Because of appreciation.
Because of the appreciation,
yes.
yeah, and rarity.
Yes.
And Your Imperial Royal Highness, I probably hinted at it before, wealth is more than just financial. But let's not kid ourselves. Financial is definitely an important part and allows a level of freedom and to some degree control. But it is deeper than that. I could argue from a family perspective, societal, our purpose. What have you learned from the history of a family that has sustained through other turbulent times, other than financial mitigation strategies, more personal lessons, stories that are passed down? And doesn't knowledge equal power coupled with connections, connectivity? How are those maintained through the centuries?
Well, maintaining your network within families, or just, as we say today, networking, know as many people as you can. Diversify and don't put all your eggs in one basket. Was probably the biggest error what my family did at the outbreak of the First World War. They had a wonderful diversified their investments around the world, but they felt it was the safest back home, so they drew all their assets back and lost it all at the end of the war. Literally. So my family started with zero in 1919.
And in terms of,
zero.
That's a lesson learned about geographic diversity, but in terms of building back up, and part of that may be land that was having to work decade after decade after decade in terms of getting it back, but what were purposeful lessons that were passed down and the value, almost confidence, or confidence maybe is competency in the family that we're going to be fine, we're going to figure it out, we have the network, we have the knowledge, and we're going to move forward and not drown in our sorrows.
Well, it's, no, crying over spilled milk, that never helped anybody. But basically it's education and a good network. So we're back to family offices. So yes, having a really good network and diversifying. It's the secret. I mean, we can talk about stories how my grandmother fled from Romania and wore her own tiara, and they didn't know she took it with her.
Wow.
Yes, and when she finally got to the United States, it was sold there, and with that she started a life. The children got an education, went to university. She did the, speech circuit. She was giving lectures at different universities and things like that. And that's how she started and earned a living.
And I believe you were going to comment, Thomas?
Yeah, maybe as an outsider, and I like to study the history of your family, and we discuss it sometimes privately. And if I may quote you, you said my family had 65 emperors of Austria in total from 1273.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, 65 roughly. And Shandor told me one time, look, there is something very easy to understand. There were 65 emperors, 10 of them were brilliant, 10 were just bad, the rest was in the middle. So I believe in something what I would call structural intelligence. That means a behavior which follows the environment and the reactions of the environment. You also told me there is no need to be the best emperor in the world, but you should have the best advisors. And one thing in your family I always admire was a break, a structural break. And this break happened in the year 1848, here in Vienna, not far from this place now, when your family decided, it was one woman as far as I know, who decided not to become Empress of Austria because her husband was the next to the throne. She decided that her son should be the next emperor, and this move was a successful one. It was the move to Franz Josef I. And this, my opinion is that this move safeguarded the Austrian Empire. Otherwise, we would have had something like a revolution as we had it in other countries.
Yes.
And that is what I connect to your question. I think the human being with the biggest flexibility in a system controls the system. And that comes back to the family office business. The more flexibility you have, the higher the probability that you not only survive, but that you are successful as an entrepreneur or as a family office maybe. And that is something we can learn from your 750 years, my opinion.
Family offices have one fundamental difference to all other different kinds of business, banks, or organizations. They're interested in legacy. They're interested in passing things on to the next generation. So we think long term, really long term. Most political systems, both financial systems, have a sort of a 5-year cycle. It's terribly short. But they don't think what is going to happen with my children, what's going to happen to my grandchildren. So most of us in my age, or more, most of us are there, our children are already grown up. So we're now thinking about educating, putting up funds for our grandchildren. And that's a completely different way of thinking. And I think that's what makes family offices also as investment bankers very interesting, because they're not looking just at short-term gains. Yes, we do some short-term stuff, obviously, but we're really trying to think in generations. And I think that's what makes these types of people and organizations so much more different in the world, and that's what the world really needs, is this really long-term thinking.
I would say that is the promise of family offices, and those that are wondering, and no one really knows for sure, because who defines as a single family office? It's a little bit of a vague term, but it's believed approximately 7,500 true single family offices around the world. So they're relatively few in number. By nature, it's an opaque industry. It's somewhat small and fragmented, and the quality, well, in anything, just using mathematical formulas, you hinted at it before, most are going to fall somewhere in the average category. But average comparative to what? If there was true benchmarking compared to classic and traditional businesses, what we deem to be a good family office may not necessarily be so good. It's not always quantifiable. A lot of it is qualitative. But qualitative, how the family feels, and the connection and communication with the family office is very important. But I suppose the bigger picture question, if the network is all powerful, and family offices are becoming a little bit of the new merchant bank and investment banker, effectively, and no offense to the family office, this is a good thing that I'm bringing it up. How could they get better? I talk about the big three in the family office, people by far number one, and then you could argue 2 and 3. I'll go with, in today's world, technology and systems. But systems are effectively created by people. How could family offices effectively measure and get better?
Well, I think the classical role of a family office, as you defined it, as a single family office, in other words, just taking care of its own family business, not services to others or groups of families together, was generally focused, primary focus was maintaining wealth, protecting wealth. But if we take the next step and say they have become the investment bankers of today, they need new tools. They need different tools. They need the tools that an investment banker has or needs. And it means shifting gears. It means taking quite a different approach. And if you take into account what is happening in the world of compliance and money laundering rules and regulations in the whole world, not just here, we do need to work with new tools. So it means going, almost like say, go back to school and start understanding how financial systems function and how to apply them the best way. Because quite frankly, the tools that we used up for the last 50 years are sort of on expiration date.
I agree with you. So that comes down to an issue of competency. And I hinted earlier about, as we have successes, we develop, it's human nature. blind spots and a little bit of ego. So the opportunity of understanding what I've learned in school might have been good at that point, my experiences and my successes may not hold up in the face of how the world works is changing. And even from we'll talk a little bit about blockchain shortly, about AI, if you stick too much to the old ways and don't adapt, that could be bad. But you're correct, family offices need to enhance their talent, their people. They need to arguably bring on people that are going to be more targeted and focused, which is they have to pull them from companies that are paying them often very handsomely. So now it's going to be an issue of acquisition of talent, which is partially due to capital, but also, why should I leave Goldman Sachs? I have access to every resource I want. I have opportunities to move up. I kind of have unlimited income if I'm an investment banker. And what do I get from working specifically for a family office? Not as much of our discussion today per se. That would be in my wheelhouse of best practices in a single family office, but these are the challenges. They don't have the resources for the most part. There's exceptions of institutional family offices for some incredible titans of finance and tech, but they're few and far between. But on a subject, Thomas, that I did bring up, blockchain. Now, you wouldn't think that talking to Thomas about gems that go back thousands of years as kind of a form of money and investing, that I would turn the attention to blockchain and its relative NFTs. But talk about how the world of gems is changing, and even in Liechtenstein in Switzerland, far ahead of the United States, far ahead on this subject, the dynamic of blockchain and NFTs and gems.
Well, there are several aspects to it. Number one, in the world of gems, the origin and ecological and social governance gets more and more important. So one possibility to use a blockchain or the blockchain is simply to connect the origin of the stone with the place or the stone where it is today. This is one possibility we have. The second one is a high quality gemstone has to have certification by international gem labs. So the question is always, how do I connect a stone with a certificate? This is second possibility. I have to use a blockchain. And the third one is simply tokenization. That means either fractional ownership of a stone, a portfolio, or ownership in something. No need to say it's a gemstone. It could be anything. Ownership I can prove to have in a portfolio. That means in a bank portfolio, in a family office portfolio, just to prove I'm the owner of it. So this is a other possibility of tokenization. And what we experience, I was not a fan of, we had some discussion today, I was not a fan of blockchain. I bought my first Bitcoin in December 21, very late. Yes, I was lucky, I sold it very well, it was a small amount, fine. And some of my employees came up 1.5, 2 years back and said, look, we have to do something. There is a new movement towards a new development, which is blockchain and tokenization, not the NFT itself, as we had it in fashion very much, but more in the direction, honestly, to get a new group of possible clients who are younger, a new group of clients who are interested in technological development. And so now, or let's say 3 years back, no bank wanted to speak about tokenization with us. Nowadays, even the bigger banks, the private banks, approach us and say, okay, how did you do it? We did it in Liechtenstein. We were the first who have a portfolio tokenized in Liechtenstein with gemstones. And now we get interest by the banks, and that's completely new to us. So there are three aspects: connection between origin of the stone and the stone itself, connection of the stone with the certificate, and number three, fractional or total ownership of a stone, so I can use an ISIN number or something like that to put it into my portfolio.
And that leads to my follow-up question. I mentioned blockchain and NFTs in an old world like gems, but now in physical assets like real estate, like gems, those vehicles or foundation of blockchain and NFTs create the opportunity for multiple investors to come in for additional liquidity, and that is done through tokenization. Now, I don't want to make it a 2-hour discussion on crypto, but I think it's important that maybe you give the audience a little bit of context relative to gems, how the blockchain and NFT technical foundation creates the opportunity for additional liquidity and opportunity through tokenization.
Well, if we speak about fractional ownership or total ownership of something, it can be art, it can be a gemstone. Number one, we all know that alternative assets are quite illiquid. We know that. They are not the most liquid things on earth. If I use a token or an NFT, I can increase liquidity of this product. Two, if I speak about art, we have one customer, he has a beautiful art collection in Austria, but he comes to us and says, okay, I have 300 paintings, and he has a big house, but still he cannot look at his paintings or his art, it's still somewhere. So this also creates the possibility of fractional or total ownership to some pieces of art as well. So for me, it increases the possibility to approach a certain class of assets. It could be wine, it could be art, it can be gemstones. So nowadays, I'm a fan of tokens or NFT in this way.
Okay. Now, Mr. Robbles said at the beginning, very important, and I want to circle back, that gemstones were a little bit out of fashion. And there's a really important reason. It's the same reason why art is very, very difficult asset. Each is unique, it's not fungible. In other words, gold and silver is really easy. I've got 1,000 bars and each of them are the same. I can buy and exchange, it's no problem. But with art and with gemstones, it doesn't work. And what is unique about this gemstone token or tokenization project is it makes gemstones fungible. This is the most important rule. And you can do it, as he said, you can do it with art as well. I can tokenize each piece of art. I can issue a certificate called an NFT, a non-fungible token, and put it together in a pot and say this token is the value, the average value of that whole pot. Therefore, it becomes tradable. In other words, you can trade it on the market, just like you can trade any commodity. Mm-hmm. This is the really, really important thing of this project. And this project has one other little detail. I'll share this with you because this is not you're going to find this printed anywhere. Is it creates a bridge between the crypto financial world and the fiat financial world. So if you hold a token, you can change it to a gemstone, and a gemstone you can change to euros or dollars. But you can take euros and dollars and buy gemstones and have tokens. Therefore, you can live in both worlds, and you can be part of both systems, regardless of which is the system that will succeed in the long term. In other words, it's the best way to mitigate risk in your investment. This is the most fundamental rule. And maybe just on a general note to tokenization, it is technology, okay? It's a new technology. It has been around as long as computers have been around. That's what most people don't understand. It's nothing new, but it works very efficiently. And I know there's a lot of rhetoric out there, it's good, it's bad. No, it's just technology. I could tokenize a whole bank and you as a customer wouldn't know it happened. Everything would still work the same way, you would still have your online interface, it would all look the same, but it could run on the blockchain. Centralized or decentralized, that's a lot of discussions. That's technology, okay? And it's a wonderful tool, and it's very efficient with modern computers. And this makes it extremely powerful. So it's not something that you have to be afraid of or worry about. It's just technology. It just takes a long time for regulations and processes and people to get their heads around it. But it's just a very good and solid technology.
Before the company which issued the token belongs to both of us. And we had a lot of philosophical questions and discussions before we did the token project. if you think one step further, we don't speak about gems, let's speak about art, let's speak about companies. If we go one step further, in reality, we are talking about currencies. That's why the law perspective of a token, the layer behind, is always the question, a token is a voucher. And the first question you get from a lawyer, do you want to create a multi-purpose or a single-purpose voucher as an underlaying of the token? Why is this question important? Because the moment you choose that it is a single-purpose voucher, you are a currency. And immediately you get problems with the central bank or with the official...
Or you're a product, so you're subject to VAT.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of little details and things to worry about there. But it's regulatory.
If we go one step further, it doesn't matter what you tokenize. If you have an underlying, you create something like a currency, some kind of.
Well, you create a currency based on a standard, be it gold or be it gemstones, or commerce.
You both partially answered it from your perspective and yours, but I'm going to slightly, in the same direction, ask a little different variation of the question, and that would be, and I hinted at it earlier as well, specifically Switzerland and Liechtenstein are way ahead of the curve, in my opinion, compared to the US and the rest of the world, relative to blockchain, to effectively NFTs and tokenization. There are some that would have felt, those are the last countries I would have expected for that, but to me it really wasn't a surprise. Talk a little bit about Switzerland and Liechtenstein from their perspective in blockchain, and maybe the perspective from a generational family, land, art, gems, gold. Wonderful, but times have changed. We're in a technological world, like you said, really since the internet became more well-known in the early 90s. To ignore blockchain, to ignore AI, may not be a great decision. So I'm giving you a little different twist of each question, but we'll start with you, Thomas.
I want to speak about Liechtenstein as number one. I think it was a purposeful decision by the government, or let's say the ruler of Liechtenstein, to decide to slid into a role of a crypto-friendly country. And as a user or as a client of the officials there, the wonderful thing behind is they react fast, they respond, and all the answers you get are right. That means they give you the answer and it is as it is. If I put the same question in Austria, I either do not get any question or it takes 9 months. So that was the reason for our decision. We did some research where we want to do it. And Liechtenstein, especially Liechtenstein, has now laws which allow the industry, what it might be, to set up some new projects under the laws of Liechtenstein and controlled. And that's the nice thing on a technical or legal basis.
In that region, in that part of Switzerland into Liechtenstein, like we have Silicon Valley in the US, that would be Crypto Valley.
Could be.
Could be Crypto Valley, yes.
Could be a small one, yeah.
And again, from the perspective of the old world assets are great. I'm probably the biggest advocate of any person from the US and diversity in those assets, but to ignore what's happening in technology, not just blindly investing in VC, but forming a thesis on blockchain and on AI. I think it would be foolish not to understand it and potentially begin to diversify your assets partially into it.
Well, first to your previous question, I just want to add to Thomas. It's a question of regulation. Liechtenstein and Switzerland defined it legally, what it is and how it has to be dealt with. This creates safety because you know you can do something and you know they're not going to change the rules on you the next day. They've defined it. The rest of the world is still, some other countries has done it well. That's the biggest problem with the technology per se. But really it is a tool, and to be able to use a new tool, all you need to do is understand it really well. This is fundamental. And when we started the tokenization project, I said, look, if anybody asks us what we're doing, they say, oh, you're going to make a new currency. I said, no, it's just a bookkeeping system. It's a ledger. I think anybody who took some basic courses, you used to have a big, thick book, we call it a Kassabuch in German, where you would write down every transaction you did, right? That's all that blockchain is. It's just filling that book. And this book just doesn't forget. So it's a real simple mechanism. But it scares people because people just don't understand it and how it works. But it's just a tool. It is the absolute best bookkeeping system than you can imagine. So if we plan a new project, we talk to some people, we plan greenhouses and things like that to produce food. Well, it needs a bookkeeping system, doesn't it? So we put it on the blockchain. We create tokens. Different tokens have different purposes. And one of them, of course, is an internal payment system. So even if we're working across borders, we have our internal token. We always have a value. And we have an exchange rate to the local currency. But it's really, that's the fundamental secret. And what's special about this project, and really what really makes it powerful, and from a family also from historical, is risk mitigation. Keep your options open. This is really important. Don't go down one-way streets. It always catches you in the end. So this project and this tokenization project, you can take as a very interesting example how it creates the bridges between the existing technology, which everybody understands, which is called fiat, and the crypto world, which very few people understand, but it's just a very good bookkeeping system. And it lets you move between it without running averse of any legal process or somebody defining you're doing something you're not supposed to do. And unfortunately, in the present climate, if it isn't defined, it should be you can do it. But they like to turn it around on you and say, no, you can't do it. So legal security, jurisdictional security is really important. That's why we chose Liechtenstein/Switzerland as a place. There are other places in the world you can do it as well. Dubai, for example, the Emirates are pushing it very hard. Another country is pushing it even harder, just so it is Bahrain is pushing it even harder, just people don't know it because nobody's talking about it. But they have created also legislation to make this happening. And the EU has finally got its legislation in place. It will take place on the 1st of January 2024, so very shortly it'll take effect. So it's a technology that has gone mainstream. And it is really a wonderful way to make whatever systems that we have more efficient and much more cost effective.
Perhaps a final question I'll have for each, and then we'd love to open it up to the audience for any questions to our great guest. I've said, I'm not the only one, the greatest threat to families, it's not investing or bad investing or taxation or bad wealth transfer. The greatest threat to the family is the family. If you look at the rising generation that is not taught capacity and capability to have competency. But I could also make the point, if the greatest threat to the family is the family, and this came up in a conversation today, the greatest advantage to a family is having skin in the game in the family. It's probably both, but how do you maximize and get the greatest value out of also the greatest risk?
Well, the first step is education, right? And knowing what you're good at. So I had a wonderful dinner many years ago with a member of the Siemens family. He was a physicist, a really smart guy. He said, but I'm a lousy administrator. So that generation realized that they weren't good at what it takes to run the family office or the family business, so they hired good people. It wasn't because they weren't smart, it was just they said, I'm not good at it, so therefore I'll make sure I hire the right people to do a good job for me. And that's probably what gets us certain families to survive the longest, because otherwise you have the classic, one guy works really hard, doesn't get too far, but creates the foundation for the next guy. He succeeds, and the next generation gives it out, and the fourth guy's got to start over again with zero. So classical family history. So how do you
Indeed.
how do you break out of that? You break out of it by being smarter and recognizing if you're not good at something, you go get that expertise from outside and pay for it.
Perhaps a bit of a follow-up question. I believe his name is Scott Pipette, is a family member of a multi-billion-dollar U.S. family and also in the family office, so he's kind of unique. He has a saying 60-30-10. He says that most family offices are 60% driven by financial success investing, 30% by, let's call it tax and estate planning, and 10% dedicated to family. And the irony is, if the greatest threat to the family is the family, how come the family office focus at best is 10%? I could agree, but I could also make the argument, is it the family office's job to be a chief learning officer and effectively help to educate and raise the children? It might be if they have someone dedicated to that role, but is it really their responsibility?
No, that's the family's responsibility. The family office is just is wealth management. How you propagate in your family to make sure that the family will succeed in the long term. It's raising your children, your family, your ethics, your principles.
Character.
Character. That's what makes it. And I just extended that basic fundamental set to also knowing when you're not good at something, let somebody else do the job for you.
And Thomas, for you, I'm going to think back to economics. I'm going to think of supply and demand within a market infrastructure. So a question on gems relative to that. I'm not going to remember all of them, you will, but colored diamonds, rubies, sapphires, some of it's going to come down to supply and demand. You travel the world, you have your ear to the grindstone. How do you know, like, are they actively searching and mining for more rubies or emeralds, and that's going to create more in the market and that's going to lower prices? How do you understand the economics behind the gems, and how do you advise your clients?
First, gemstones in total are in economics called a superior good. That means the income elasticity is higher than 1. In other terms, the richer people get, the more stones they usually buy, both in jewelry and investment stones. That's number 1. Number 2, the biggest demand for stones today come from Asia. That means the biggest demand countries today in the world are China and India and Indonesia, then the rest of the world. You told me, or you talked about risk. The biggest risk for the gemstone industry in total would be a complete failure of China or India. So that's the risk side. On the other side, on the supply side, yes, we search for stones all the time, but we know the composition of stones, what they consist of, and where to find them. And the deeper, like with gold and oil, the deeper you have to go, the higher the costs to find them. And we face, you can call it a problem or an advantage as you like, and this is the ecological point. Here in Austria, we have the oldest source of emeralds in the world. It's in the Habachtal in Salzburg. The first emeralds there were found in the year 100, that's for sure, but we cannot search them as there are ecological points. And we get more and more in the direction, also with countries like Mozambique, Zambia, Sri Lanka, where they say, okay, only this method of mining, only this form of mining, and nothing else. It makes the production cost higher. Are there more stones in the earth below us? Yeah, sure, there are, but they are quite far below us. So on the one hand side, we have some supply, which is restricted. On the other hand side, we have a high demand for high quality stones. So in the long run, I am positive that the prices will go up. Am I sure? No, that's not possible. If there are external shocks, of course, there can happen something, but in the long run, I'm positive.
Interesting. And again, someone like myself who, I don't know if I'd say I see the glasses half full or half empty, but I do look at things from a risk perspective. Inevitably, everything, I guess you could say, goes to zero. It's just a matter of a timeline. And that timeline for gems could be billions of years. I don't think there's anything else I could state that about. I could think of companies when I was growing up, IBM and others, I never thought they wouldn't be a top 10 company. Now, most younger people have no idea who they are. Facebook is really just 2 decades old. So that's the amazing thing about how we started in turbulent times and land and art and gold and in gems. They have a long, long history. We do have some time, I believe, for some audience interaction and questions. Alexander, if anyone raising their hand that has any